Long before prophecy became something written in leather-bound books or whispered through radio static, it existed as a practical tool for survival. Early human societies did not separate prophecy from observation. The future was not mystical, it was inferred. The stars moved in patterns. Rivers flooded on cycles. Animals migrated, disappeared, returned. To predict was simply to notice long enough. What we now call prophecy began as pattern recognition under uncertainty. The earliest prophecies were not grand visions of world endings or chosen saviors. They were local, cautious, and often conditional. If the rains fail, hunger will come. If the king angers the gods, the city will fall. These were not vague statements, they were risk assessments framed in symbolic language that people could remember, repeat, and obey. One of the first places where prophecy formalized itself was Oracle of Delphi. Perched above a fault line, the oracle did not issue clear instructions. Instead, responses arrived as riddles, statements that forced interpretation rather than obedience. This ambiguity was not a flaw. It was a feature. A prophecy that could be interpreted after the fact would always appear correct. A famous example involves Croesus, who asked whether he should wage war against Persia. The oracle replied that if he did, a great empire would fall. Croesus assumed it would be Persia. It was his own. History would later record this as a fulfilled prophecy, not a failed one. This structure, conditional, symbolic, retrospective, became the backbone of prophetic tradition across cultures. In ancient Mesopotamia, eclipse records doubled as warnings of political collapse. In early China, cracked oracle bones documented questions about harvests, wars, and succession. In Egypt, priestly calendars quietly aligned celestial movements with dynastic stability. None of these societies believed prophecy was random. They believed the future left traces. What's striking is how often these early prophecies did come true, not because they were supernatural, but because they were rooted in repeatable pressures: climate stress, population growth, military overreach, and social inequality. When a prophecy warned that arrogance would bring ruin, it was usually correct, not because the gods intervened, but because systems under strain tend to fail in familiar ways. Over time, prophecy evolved from a tool of survival into a tool of authority. If you could convincingly claim knowledge of the future, you could influence behavior in the present. Prophets became advisors to kings, then critics of kings, then threats to kings. Some were absorbed into power structures. Others were silenced. But the idea endured. The future could speak, and certain people could hear it first. Even at this early stage, a quiet tension formed, one that still exists today. Were prophecies being fulfilled because they revealed truth, or because people acted as if they were true? That question never went away. In later segments, prophecy will harden into scripture, fracture into competing timelines, survive failed predictions, and adapt to science, statistics, and machines. But it all begins here, in a world where the future was not yet distant, abstract, or theoretical. It was close enough to feel, and uncertain enough to fear. As civilizations grew larger and more complex, prophecy changed shape. It was no longer enough to predict floods or failed harvests. Empires demanded foresight on a grander scale: war, collapse, exile, and return. And so prophecy began to move closer to history, sometimes so close that the line between prediction and record quietly dissolved. This is where some of the most famous, fulfilled prophecies emerge. In the ancient Near East, prophetic texts often appeared after catastrophic events, framed as warnings that had been ignored. The destruction of cities, the fall of kingdoms, and mass displacement were not treated as surprises, but as confirmations. The logic was simple and powerful: we were warned, and we failed to listen. One of the clearest examples comes from the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Later texts describe prophets foretelling the city's destruction due to moral decay, political arrogance, and alliance building with stronger empires. When Babylon eventually destroyed the city, these writings gained immense authority, not because they prevented disaster, but because they explained it. Prophecy here served a psychological purpose. It restored order to chaos. If destruction had been foretold, then history was not meaningless. It was corrective. A similar pattern appears in the classical world. Roman writers, looking back on the Republic's collapse, frequently cited omens and predictions, comets, dreams, malformed animals, strange weather, as signs that the transition to empire had been inevitable. The future, once uncertain, was retroactively rendered obvious. The most famous case involves Julius Caesar and the warning to beware the Ides of March. Whether or not the warning existed in the form later recorded hardly mattered. After Caesar's assassination, the prophecy became fixed in cultural memory. A vague caution turned into a precise and chilling fulfillment. This retroactive sharpening is a recurring trait of prophecy. Predictions tend to become clearer after events have occurred. Ambiguity collapses. Meaning crystallizes. What was once symbolic becomes literal. Yet not all fulfilled prophecies were written after the fact. In the medieval period, one prediction gained fame precisely because it seemed to anticipate real, verifiable events, the visions attributed to Hildegard of Bingen. Her writings described social decay, corruption within institutions, environmental disruption, and periods of upheaval followed by renewal. Centuries later, readers would point to plagues, schisms, and wars and say, "She saw this coming." What made these prophecies convincing was not their specificity, but their alignment with recurring historical pressures. Society's centralized power, lost legitimacy, fractured, and reformed. A prophecy that described this cycle would always feel prescient. By this stage, prophecy had evolved into something subtle and resilient. It no longer needed exact dates or names. It only needed to describe patterns of failure that humans repeat reliably. That resilience explains why prophecy survived failed predictions. When timelines passed without fulfillment, interpretations shifted. Symbols were redefined. The future had not lied. It had merely been misunderstood. And so prophecy entered a new phase, no longer a single voice warning a single city, but a layered archive of expectations, failures, reinterpretations, and confirmations. Each catastrophe strengthened belief, not weakened it, because every collapse seemed to prove the same thing. Someone had already seen it coming, and somewhere the warning was still written, waiting to be read again. By the early modern period, prophecy faced a problem it had never encountered before: measurement. The world was becoming quantifiable. Time was standardized. Maps became precise. Printing fixed words in place. A prediction could now be checked, dated, and disproven. And yet, prophecy did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. This era produced some of the most famous prophetic figures in history, not because they were consistently accurate, but because their predictions were structured to survive failure. The most enduring example is Nostradamus. His quatrains were not predictions in the modern sense. They were compressed symbolic fields, dense with metaphor, shifting grammar, and deliberate obscurity. Names were distorted. Dates were absent. Locations blurred. This was not accidental. A prophecy that could mean many things could never be fully wrong. When the Great Fire of London erupted in 1666, readers found verses that suddenly seemed unmistakable. When Napoleon rose, then Hitler, then global war itself, Nostradamus was rediscovered each time, his writings reshaped to fit the present crisis. The prophecy did not change. The reader did. What made this powerful was repetition. Each generation inherited a world already primed to believe that someone, somewhere, had predicted what was happening now. Prophecy became less about foresight and more about confirmation. It told people that chaos had context. The same phenomenon appeared in religious millennial movements. Predictions of world endings clustered around symbolic dates: 1000 CE, 1666, 1844, 1914, 2000. When these dates passed uneventfully, belief rarely collapsed. Instead, explanations emerged. Calculations were flawed. Timelines were symbolic. Fulfillment had occurred invisibly. The failure itself became part of the prophecy. This is where prophecy reveals its most durable trait. It converts disappointment into deeper conviction. A missed prediction does not necessarily weaken belief. It often strengthens it by creating an inner circle that understands the true meaning. Even scientific revolutions did not eliminate prophecy, they rebranded it. Economic collapses were foreseen by analysts after the fact. Political revolutions were framed as inevitable by thinkers who had warned of instability years earlier. Technological disruption began producing its own prophets, visionaries predicting automation, collapse, or transcendence. By the 20th century, prophecy had quietly merged with forecasting. The language changed, but the structure remained. Models replaced visions. Charts replaced symbols. But the underlying message was familiar. The future is already forming, and some can see it more clearly than others. What separates prophecy from prediction is not accuracy, it is narrative. A prophecy does not aim to be right. It aims to be remembered. And the most successful prophecies of this era were the ones that could always be rediscovered at the moment they felt most necessary, during uncertainty, fear, and transition. They refused to die because they did not belong to any single future. They belonged to every unstable present. At certain moments in history, prophecy stopped being a distant warning or a cryptic text and became something far more dangerous, a reason to act. When belief in the future hardened into certainty, people no longer waited for prophecy to unfold. They tried to fulfill it themselves. This is where prophecy intersected with power, violence, and national identity. One of the clearest examples is Joan of Arc. She did not predict the future in abstract symbols. She claimed direct instruction that France would be saved, that a crowned king would be restored, and that she herself had a role to play. These were not vague outcomes. They were immediate, political, and actionable. What makes her story unsettling is not whether her visions were divine or psychological. It's that the prophecy worked. Armies rallied. Morale shifted. Strategic decisions changed. The future altered course because enough people believed that it already had. This pattern appears repeatedly. When a prophecy aligns with existing social pressure, war exhaustion, national humiliation, economic collapse, it becomes catalytic. It gives chaos a direction. In the Protestant Reformation, prophetic language framed institutional decay as inevitable and divinely sanctioned. Reformers did not merely criticize corruption, they cast it as fulfillment. History was not drifting, it was advancing toward a necessary rupture. Violence, once unthinkable, became justified as obedience to destiny. Prophecy here functioned as moral acceleration. Something similar unfolded during revolutionary periods. In 18th century France, intellectuals spoke of historical inevitability, of monarchy giving way to reason, of old orders collapsing under their own contradictions. Though framed in secular language, the structure was prophetic. The future was no longer open-ended. It was owed. Once a future is perceived as guaranteed, restraint weakens. This is the dangerous threshold where prophecy stops describing patterns and starts overriding ethical hesitation. If collapse is foretold, why preserve what is already doomed? If salvation is promised, why doubt the cost? Not all action-based prophecies succeeded. Many ended in disaster, cult collapse, or violent suppression. But even failed movements left echoes, stories of near fulfillment, betrayal, or delay. The prophecy had not been wrong. It had been interrupted. By this stage, prophecy had become something more than belief. It was a technology of motivation. It could mobilize armies, fracture societies, and rewrite loyalties faster than law or reason. And crucially, it did not require universal belief, only enough belief at the right moment. This raises an uncomfortable question that history never fully answers. Did these prophecies come true because they were accurate, or because people made them true by refusing to imagine another future? As the world moved toward industrialization and mass communication, prophecy would not fade. Instead, it would fragment, splitting into private visions, mass movements, and hidden archives of prediction waiting for the next moment of instability. And there would be many more moments to come. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, prophecy encountered something new and unsettling: statistics. The future was no longer accessed only through visions, omens, or sacred texts. It was increasingly approached through data: birth rates, production curves, population growth, resource depletion. And yet, the result looked eerily familiar. The language changed. The function did not. Thinkers began issuing warnings that sounded less like revelations and more like equations, but they carried the same weight as ancient prophecy. One of the earliest and most influential examples came from Thomas Malthus, who argued that population growth would inevitably outpace food production, leading to famine, collapse, and social unrest. His predictions did not unfold exactly as described. Technology intervened. Agriculture intensified. Yet Malthus was never dismissed. Instead, he became conditionally correct. His prophecy was said to apply in the long run, under constraints, or without innovation. Like ancient oracles, his warning adapted to survive. Later came predictions of industrial exhaustion, financial collapse, and imperial decline. Economists, demographers, and engineers began forecasting futures with charts instead of symbols. But structurally, these forecasts behaved like prophecy. They described inevitability. They warned of thresholds. They framed outcomes as unavoidable unless behavior changed. And when change failed to occur, collapse validated the warning. The 20th century produced some of the most striking examples of prophecy that looked like science. Predictions about world wars, environmental degradation, and economic cycles were often written decades in advance. When events arrived, authors were rediscovered and elevated to prophetic status, not because they knew the future, but because they understood systemic pressure. The Great Depression turned forgotten warnings into fulfilled predictions overnight. So did oil shocks, financial crashes, and ecological crises. Each time, people search backward, not forward, asking the same question: who saw this coming? This period also introduced a crucial shift: prophecy without prophets. No single voice claimed revelation. Instead, institutions spoke: think tanks, research bodies, international panels. Their reports were cautious, probabilistic, footnoted. But the public heard something simpler: this will happen. When projections failed, credibility did not vanish. Timelines moved. Variables were revised. Models updated. Like ancient prophecy, the future had not been wrong, we had misunderstood it. At the same time, a quieter undercurrent emerged. As forecasting grew more technical, belief fractured. Some trusted models completely. Others rejected them outright, turning back to older prophetic traditions or inventing new ones. The future, once centralized, became contested terrain. By the end of this era, prophecy existed in two parallel forms. One wore the mask of objectivity. The other embraced symbolism and faith. Both claimed authority over what had not yet happened. And both shared a defining trait inherited from their ancient ancestors. They were less about predicting the future than about shaping how people behaved in the present. In the next segment, prophecy will encounter mass media, radio, television, and the internet, and something profound will happen. Predictions will no longer wait to be discovered. They will be broadcast. Mass media did something to prophecy that no previous technology ever had. It accelerated it. Before radio and television, prophecy traveled slowly. It moved through manuscripts, sermons, rumor, and inheritance. Belief had time to mature, fragment, and localize. But once the future could be spoken into millions of homes at once, prophecy stopped being something you encountered. It became something that found you. The 20th century marked the beginning of broadcast prophecy. Radio preachers, political commentators, and ideological visionaries began speaking in absolute terms about what must happen next. Economic collapse, moral decay, war, renewal, salvation. The specifics varied, but the structure was always familiar: "We are at a turning point, and those who fail to listen will regret it." Television intensified this effect. The camera added authority. A confident voice, a studio backdrop, a countdown clock, these elements transformed speculation into certainty. The future was no longer distant or symbolic. It was imminent. One striking example came from religious broadcasting, where end-times predictions gained mass followings. Figures like Harold Camping issued precise dates for global judgment. When those dates passed without incident, belief did not simply dissolve. Followers recalculated. Explanations emerged. The prophecy had not failed. It had unfolded invisibly or spiritually or on a delayed timeline. This pattern was no longer fringe. It became mainstream. Political prophecy followed the same arc. Cold War rhetoric framed history as a countdown toward nuclear annihilation or ideological victory. Each crisis reinforced the sense that humanity stood permanently on the edge of fulfillment or extinction. When catastrophe was narrowly avoided, it was treated as postponement, not disproof. Mass media also introduced a new feedback loop. Predictions influenced behavior, which then altered outcomes, which were then framed as confirmation or interference. The future became reflexive, shaped by the very warnings meant to describe it. At the same time, media created a competitive marketplace for prophecy. Attention rewarded urgency. The most extreme predictions traveled farthest. Conditional forecasts disappeared beneath certainty and spectacle. If you wanted to be heard, the future had to be dramatic. This is when prophecy began to feel permanent. There was always a crisis, always a threshold, always a moment just ahead that would explain everything. The future never arrived, but it never stopped approaching. And then came the internet. With it, prophecy fractured completely. No single voice dominated. Countless timelines competed. Some were algorithmically amplified. Others faded into obscurity. Belief no longer required community, it required repetition. By the end of this segment of history, prophecy no longer needed ancient authority, sacred language, or even consistency. It only needed reach. The future had become content, and everyone suddenly was allowed to predict it. At some point in the early digital age, prophecy stopped sounding mystical and started sounding technical. Predictions were no longer framed as visions or warnings, but as outputs. They came from models, simulations, and learning systems that promised something ancient in a new voice. The future could be calculated. This was a subtle but profound shift. Where earlier prophecy relied on authority or symbolism, algorithmic prophecy relied on scale. Millions of data points replaced intuition. Patterns emerged not from meditation or revelation, but from correlation. What people bought, searched, watched, feared, or ignored became signals. The future was no longer whispered, it was inferred. This gave rise to a new class of prophets, futurists, technologists, and system theorists. Figures like Ray Kurzweil did not claim divine insight. They claimed exponential curves. Moore's law became a kind of secular oracle, predicting not just faster computers, but radical transformations of labor, intelligence, and identity itself. What made these predictions persuasive was not belief, it was performance. Algorithms demonstrably worked. They predicted consumer behavior, traffic flows, disease spread, and market movements with unsettling accuracy. If a system could predict what you would buy tomorrow, why couldn't it predict the shape of civilization in 50 years? Yet something familiar reappeared. These predictions, too, clustered around inevitability. Automation would replace workers. Artificial intelligence would surpass human cognition. Institutions would fail. Humanity would either transcend itself or collapse under its own complexity. The language was technical, but the structure was prophetic. And like prophecy before it, algorithmic forecasting blurred causality. When systems predicted social behavior, institutions acted on those predictions. When institutions acted, behavior changed. The future began bending toward the forecast, not because it was destined, but because it was anticipated. This era also revived an old problem, interpretive flexibility. When timelines slipped, explanations followed. Adoption was slower than expected. Regulation intervened. Cultural resistance delayed the curve. The prophecy remained intact, only the horizon moved. Once again, the future was not wrong, it was merely postponed. At the same time, digital culture produced a countercurrent. As official forecasts grew more complex and abstract, people gravitated towards simpler, older narratives. Ancient prophecies were rediscovered and reinterpreted through modern lenses. Calendar systems, symbolic dates, and forgotten predictions resurfaced online, stripped of context and re-injected with urgency. What mattered was no longer origin or credibility. What mattered was resonance. By the end of this phase, prophecy had split into two streams flowing in parallel. One spoke in equations and probability distributions. The other spoke in symbols, intuition and fear. Both claimed to describe the same future. And increasingly, both were mediated by machines. In the next segment, prophecy will turn inward. It will stop describing the fate of civilizations and begin predicting something closer, more intimate, and far more unsettling: the future of the individual. At some point, prophecy stopped speaking in grand civilizational terms and began whispering something far more personal. You. Not humanity. Not empires. Not history. Just the individual. Your choices, your fears, your likely future. This is where prophecy became intimate. Recommendation systems predicted what you would watch before you knew you wanted. Credit models estimated your reliability. Health algorithms forecast your risk of illness. Law enforcement experimented with predictive policing. Insurance companies priced futures into premiums. None of this was framed as prophecy, but functionally, it was. The future of your life was being estimated in advance. What made this unsettling was not accuracy alone, but invisibility. Ancient prophecy announced itself. It arrived with ceremony. Modern predictive systems operate quietly, constantly, without symbolic language or dramatic warning. You are not told what future has been assigned to you, only what options remain. This shift echoes an older anxiety found in literature and philosophy. In the 20th century, writers began imagining futures where prediction itself became a form of control. Philip K. Dick explored worlds where foreknowledge collapsed free will, not through force, but through anticipation. If a system already knows what you will do, resistance begins to feel pointless. What separates modern prediction from classical prophecy is feedback. When people learn how they are being categorized, they adapt. They perform differently. They hide, exaggerate, or game the system. The prophecy responds. The loop tightens. And yet, just like ancient prophecy, these systems are not neutral. They are built on past data, historical bias, structural inequality, repeated patterns of success and failure. When a system predicts that certain outcomes are likely, it often reinforces the conditions that make them so. The prophecy fulfills itself quietly, without spectacle. This is where belief becomes optional. You do not need to believe in a predictive system for it to affect you. It shapes access, opportunity, and visibility regardless. In earlier eras, prophecy persuaded through faith. Now it persuades through infrastructure. At the same time, a strange cultural reversal occurs. As predictive systems become more powerful, people begin seeking unpredictability as a form of freedom. Randomness, intuition, and even superstition return, not as belief systems but as resistance. If the future is being calculated, then mystery becomes refuge. This sets the stage for a new kind of prophecy, one that does not come from ancient texts or modern institutions, but from individuals inventing futures that feel plausible, personal, and just out of reach. Which leads to the final transformation. In the next segment, prophecy will leave history behind altogether and begin creating futures that have never existed, but feel as though they already have. By the time prophecy reaches the present era, something curious has happened. The future is no longer distant enough to be feared abstractly, nor mysterious enough to feel sacred. It is crowded, overwritten, saturated with scenarios that feel inevitable even when they have no clear origin. This is the age of borrowed futures. Some of the most widely cited modern prophecies come from figures whose reputations were built almost entirely after their deaths. Baba Vanga is one such case. Predictions attributed to her include the collapse of superpowers, global warming, pandemics, and technological upheaval. The problem is not whether these events occurred, it's that the prophecies themselves were rarely recorded contemporaneously. They surfaced later, curated, translated, and refined to fit unfolding events. What makes them convincing is not precision, but plausibility. They describe futures that feel statistically likely rather than divinely revealed. And because those futures are already being discussed elsewhere, in science, politics, and media, the prophecy feels less like a claim and more like confirmation. A similar phenomenon surrounds apocalyptic timelines tied to calendar systems, technological thresholds, or symbolic dates. The year 2000 was one such moment. So was 2012. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the belief that something almost happened persists. The prophecy did not fail. It brushed past reality closely enough to leave a residue of unease. This residue matters. Modern prophecy increasingly operates by atmosphere rather than assertion. It creates a sense that we are always on the verge of revelation, collapse, or transformation. Climate tipping points, artificial intelligence thresholds, demographic shifts, and geopolitical instability are framed not as possibilities, but as countdowns. What's different now is that these predictions do not belong to any single tradition. They are composites, stitched together from science reports, leaked memos, ancient texts, online speculation, and cultural memory. A prophecy today might reference satellites, scripture, economic graphs, and folklore in the same breath. And people believe them, not fully, but enough. Enough to feel anxious. Enough to prepare. Enough to reinterpret personal experiences as signs. The future becomes a lens through which the present is decoded. This is also where entirely new prophecies begin to appear, anonymous, decentralized, and intentionally unverifiable. They emerge in forums, videos, comment threads, and half-remembered posts. They speak of slow collapses rather than sudden ends, of systems quietly withdrawing rather than exploding, of civilizations not falling but thinning. What gives these modern prophecies their power is restraint. They avoid spectacle. They predict things already half visible, declining trust, retreat from institutions, fragmentation into smaller realities. Nothing dramatic, nothing unbelievable, just continuation. By now, prophecy has completed a strange loop. It no longer needs the past for authority. It borrows credibility from the present itself. If a future feels like the logical extension of today, it does not need proof. It only needs repetition. And that opens the door to something new. Prophecies not inherited, not rediscovered, but designed. Which brings us to the final segment. Not the end of prophecy, but its quiet reinvention. At the far edge of this long history, prophecy no longer arrives from temples, mystics, or even institutions. It arrives from imagination, but imagination disciplined by history. These are not wild visions. They are futures engineered to feel uncomfortably reasonable. These are the prophecies that have not yet happened. They do not announce themselves as revelation. They appear as observations phrased one step ahead of the present. They borrow the tone of analysis, the cadence of inevitability, and the humility of uncertainty. And that is what makes them dangerous or persuasive. Consider the prophecy of the quiet retreat. It does not predict collapse. It predicts withdrawal. Governments remain. Markets function. Technology advances. But participation thins. People disengage from large systems they no longer trust, politics, national identity, shared narratives. They do not rebel. They simply stop showing up. Cities hollow slowly. Institutions persist, but without belief. History records no single breaking point, only a long, silent step backward. Nothing dramatic happens, which is why it feels plausible. Then there is the prophecy of the narrow future. It claims that humanity will not face extinction or transcendence, but compression. Options shrink. Paths converge. Innovation continues, but within tighter boundaries. Fewer acceptable ways to live. Fewer tolerated beliefs. Fewer viable identities. Not through tyranny, but optimization. Systems favor what works and quietly starve what doesn't. The future becomes efficient, predictable, and smaller than expected. People will later say they were warned. Another emerging prophecy speaks of delayed consequences. According to this vision, the most transformative events of the 21st century will not be recognized when they occur. They will appear trivial at the time: policy changes, software updates, cultural shifts, demographic adjustments. Only decades later will historians realize that the future pivoted quietly, without ceremony or panic. There will be no Ides of March moment, only footnotes that turn out to be load-bearing. And finally, there is the prophecy of the remembered future. It suggests that humanity will increasingly experience the future as something already familiar. Not because it has happened before, but because it has been simulated, discussed, visualized, and narrated so thoroughly that when it arrives, it feels like déjà vu. People will say, "This is exactly what we expected," even when they did nothing to prevent it. The future will feel pre-lived. What unites these new prophecies is restraint. They do not predict fire or salvation. They predict continuation under strain. They are believable because they do not demand belief, only recognition. And that may be the final evolution of prophecy. Not a voice crying out against the present. Not a vision descending from elsewhere. But a mirror held slightly ahead of where we stand. Close enough to ignore. Close enough to accept. Close enough to feel inevitable. If prophecy once warned humanity of what might come, it now asks something quieter and far more difficult. When the future feels obvious, do we still have the courage to choose differently?